Hi all. So thanks very much for inviting me here today. I think I don't think there'll be too many surprises in what I'm going to be talking about in the next while. Many of them have, I think, already either come up in conversation or some of them will be reasonably obvious to you. A little bit about me and my company. So the company I work for is called OpenAPP. We've been around since about 2002. We've been working with registries since about 2012. Most of the work we do is with patient organizations or clinical organizations, and some of those have been sponsored by pharmaceutical companies or health systems. I'm going to go into that a little bit in a while. We also work with the ERNs, with the European reference networks. We provide the collaboration system that they use between the expert centers to exchange patient data. And you can see a list there of some of the organizations that we have, the conditions that we have worked on along the way. Registries are core to what we do, from the ethics of it as well as commercially. And the other half of the business is on the health analytics side of things. That's almost exclusively, or that's really only in Ireland. Registries we're working on a global side of things. Enough about me. So what I want to talk about then today is some of the things that we have seen along the way from some of the organizations that we've dealt with, and at least from our perspective, what the patterns we see among them to make them successful. This photo that's there was something that just popped up on Twitter today. I know for some organizations they use zebra as a symbol for the rare disease community, but this was even rare among the rare itself. So it was so the 7 steps, I think, and this is pretty reasonable for lots of different things that we're going to be looking at. You want to outline your vision. What is it that we want to do? And be clear about your vision, and even whether it's a short-term or long-term. You want to understand the stakeholders. We've already been looking a little bit about that today and understanding that a little bit. Defining the data. That is a lot harder than you may think at first, especially when you get more than one clinician in the room. Design, develop, and deploy. I'll talk a little bit more about that one, but that's an important step along the way. Gathering the data, engaging with your community, making sure that the data is actually collectible. And generating the information is actually answer some of those questions. That one of the first questions on the last sheet that you worked on is, are we gathering the data to actually enable us to answer the core questions that are important here? Review and go back again. And so there's 2 examples I'm going to do towards the end of this. One is for a contact registry and the other is for a clinical registry. But you can see the steps that we have here. You could use exactly the same steps here. If you were building a house, you want to say, well, is it a 1-story house or is it a mansion I want to build? What's your mission there? And all the way along as you engage with the architect, as you engage with the planners, or as you engage with the builders. The steps here should hopefully be fairly obvious and make sense as we move along. So your vision, what is it that you want to do? The actual purpose of the registry. And that purpose can change over time, but use the phases of your project to say, the first step here, for the next 2 years, what we're trying to do is this. Because with that vision, that helps you get your stakeholders involved. That helps potentially to get you funding, get your clinicians, your researchers, other people in other patient groups around the world. Many of you have conditions where there may only be a handful of patients that you have either ever met or in England or in Europe. So it's an important thing that at least if you state the purpose, you get others on your side to fight for that same purpose with you. There are not a huge number of registries out there. A lot of registries are clinical, they're academic, they're not particularly set up to engage with patients. There is a lot of registries out there that Rick has mentioned earlier are product registries. The data is locked up behind the company doors. You will never get access to that. Researchers outside the company will never get access to that data. So again, it's something to understand the motivation of others and the reasons why it's much better to have that data back into the community, whether it's in a patient organization or a clinical organization with strong ethics behind them. What's the outputs you want from it? If it is a 2-year window that you have on it, at the end of 2 years, what is it that you want to be able to produce from the registry? Is it a plan to support researchers? Is it to get researchers networked among each other? Is it to improve your own organization standing from an advocacy perspective? So there's a lot of questions that you should be working through, because that will give you the anchor that you need for the first version of your registry that you want to do. And you should absolutely think you will go through iterations of your registry. The first version may only be a contact registry. I'm sure many of you are using Excel spreadsheets or pieces of paper to identify, well, here's the other people around the world, around the country, or my region, and I've mailing lists I can email them out. Well, that's a registry. That's the first step. The next bit then is more basic, more information on your demographics or maybe the disease burden, and all the way along through clinical registry, supporting researchers, to pharmacovigilance was mentioned here earlier on. That's where the pharma companies really want to get access to data. Your governance, hugely important. When you're saying to your patient, the members of your organization, we want to collect your data. Well, who owns it? What access are you going to give to other people along the way? What questions are you going to allow to be answered? Now, many of those things, you've probably all heard about GDPR at this point in time. And if you want your registry to be used within a health organization, you've got to pass ethics approvals. And for pharmaceutical companies, they have their own ethics approvals as well. Consent is a huge thing here. And then that your governance backs that up along the way. And in there you also have to say, here's the purposes for which we're going to gather the data. You want to be relatively prescriptive about it, but allow yourself to say, we want to contact you if a clinical trial comes up. We want to use your anonymized data to actually support researchers. So they will never be able to identify you or anyone else in the organization. And if they want to go back and ask a question, they will have a way to ask your organization to say, we've identified 3 patients and the data looks strange. Can we contact them? And if the consent that you have for collecting data allows you to go back and talk to those 3 patients, well, then you can ask them, do you want to be contacted by the researchers? But it's an important thing to consider along the way. Sustainability is a huge one. How can you possibly get the funding to support the various different parts of the costs involved in registries? And there's multiple different costs along the way, from your own organizational, the extra burden it puts on your own organization, to the registry infrastructure that you may need, to potentially hiring 1 or 2 or 3 individuals, whatever it might be, to get the data input into the system. And then maybe run your statistical analysis plans after that to support the outputs that you want from the system. And understand where's the roots for this sustainability. And there's multiple to consider. I'm not going to say it's easy to get access to any of this or anything like it, but pharmaceutical companies do have educational grants. Researchers obviously have many of the things that they're trying to do, or academics generally, they're under pressure these days to bring in funds, and some of that potentially can be used to pay for the setup of the registry, to pay for the data entry, and so on. And then there's other charitable organizations as well that you shouldn't rule out as potential sources of funds. Then the last point in your own vision is who owns the data. The data that you produce out of this, to me, it's the patient organization or the clinical organization should own that data. It's not a commercial entity that may want to repurpose that data for something else. If you own the data, it means you own that interaction with any of these other organizations. Potentially, that's another source of funding as well. Pharmaceutical companies have various different criteria within which they can actually provide funding to organizations. They can provide educational grants, or they can pay for data. And there is a market value on your data. And you just make sure that the contract you have between yourself and the pharmaceutical organization means that they have to use it in the way that you prescribe, the way that your data governance allows them to use it. Okay? So again, I'm not trying to scare you with all of the different questions that you may have along the way, but as you go through that range of starting with a contact registry, there's many different things that you should consider, even if you consider it and park the question and come back to it again. And there are many organizations out there that have successfully set up registries and would consider themselves successfully running registries, that there is templates there to look at and to understand. So your stakeholders, we talked a little bit about it today. You're obviously the first stakeholder, at least from the way I'm thinking about it, is your community, the other patients that are involved here, the carers, and whether that community is also your national or you have a broader view and you're also trying to reach out internationally as well. The population here in the UK is what, 60, 70 million, somewhere like that. It's tiny. It's really, really tiny. And you have, going at least at the European level, you have nearly 10 times that. You include the US, it's another 300 million. India, 1.1 million. You know, there's lots of different parts of the world where the condition that you have, and you guys know this better than I do, where there's subpopulations in different parts of the world where the condition that you're trying to help, you may have quite an extensive subpopulation that actually, if you can reach into that population, the data that can support you and your research is as important as just building the registry for your 10, 100, your 500 patients here. And it is the data. That's what registries is all about. It's collecting data that will support your advocacy, your research, your pharmacovigilance, your quality of care, your benchmarking. It's all of these things that you need to think about that's what the data supports. And effectively what we're talking about with the data like that is it's recognizing patterns within the data. There's many different subgroups and different ages, genders, treatments that may be used and that might work successfully on a subgroup may not work for another group for some reason or another. Clinicians then, they care about, obviously it's a quality of care. Is there something that is happening in another center that they should know about and understand that actually they should be replicating that? A famous case, I think, between New York and Toronto, where looking at, I think it was around cystic fibrosis, and the diet of the patients in Toronto was significantly different than it was in New York. And the outcomes for the patients was significantly different. So it wasn't actually anything to do with a medical treatment, but once you're recording some of that data, you suddenly see there's simple things we can do that improves the quality of life of people as well along the way. Standards of care as a general thing. When this happens, we should be doing this. Clinicians they're seen as gods by many. but they don't see all the patterns. They definitely don't if they only see 3 or 4 or 5 patients like you, and they only see you once, twice, 3 times a year. The patterns escape them unless they, like most health systems, they're designed to capture generic data. Most of the data is captured as clinical notes. You can't see patterns by reading back through text. You actually have to dig into the data to understand it. And so registries, it's structuring those medical notes into yes/no questions, into a degree of, is it serious or pretty mild, from 1 to 10? What's exactly the treatment? How long did it last? There's many of these things that you want to gather as a clinician, and they do gather it, but it just doesn't get organized in a way that they can understand what the patterns are, what they need to understand to improve that quality of care, to improve the quality of life, or to look at clinical trials as well along the way. Benchmarking, how does this patient in front of me compare with what I would have expected at this point in their condition? And it may be down to maybe gender, maybe racial background, maybe at what point the condition was actually diagnosed correctly. All of those things, it's patterns that they look for to understand, here's the prognosis. If we don't make a change here now, we can see others have gone on to this treatment. It hasn't resolved anything, but it's halted it. Or maybe actually at this point in time, it's too late for this treatment. The side effects are just not worth it, that there's no significant difference at this point. So these are patterns, again, unless you're recording the data in an organized way, you won't see it. Adverse events clinicians are interested in. And so adverse events are unexpected events, unexpected clinical events related to treatment, related to care. They need to record this for good ethical reasons. And if you're on a specific treatment, especially the orphan drugs treatment, it might be, the bar may be quite high in terms of how important adverse events are and who they need to be reported to. Yeah, talked about patterns and so on there. Researchers. For researchers, you're trying to give them data so that they understand there is a cohort here. There is a set of patients here that it is worth your time getting into the research here. And even if those patients are in a different country, it doesn't matter. We're going to give you the data, because a lot of researchers, to be harsh about it, never particularly meet patients. They're in a lab somewhere, a lot of them. I'm not going to say all of them. But for them, it's the data is what they work with. And they are collecting that data, and they want to know they get good quality data, they can get it relatively regularly, and they have a way to feed back to the clinical teams. Normally they do that through published papers, but again, through a registry, it can be a much more structured way to feed back. And again, it's the population level natural history. So for researchers, the natural history is, without treatment, here is the progression of this particular condition. And in the rare disease world, the clinical trials are usually on a very small number of patients. For spinal muscular atrophy, the Spinraza drug that Biogen has, it was only on, I think, maybe 100 patients across the world. It's a tiny number of patients. So when the researchers and the European Medicines Agency or the FDA in the US, when they're looking at, well, has this treatment actually shown any benefit? It's very hard for them to look at it at just 110 patients, but they look at those 100 or 110 patients and compare that with, well, here's what we have in the registry where nobody has been treated because they don't have access to it. a lot of clinical trials in the general health space outside of this, you will have a clinical trial that is, this 100 patients are on the drug and this 100 patients are not on the drug. So that you have a very distinct difference between the two. Whereas now the likes of the EMA and the FDA are accepting data from well-run registries, and it is, they do have a criteria there you have to meet, well-run registries to say, if you're recording the data in the right way and you have all the right checks and balances on it, we will treat that as one of the arms of a clinical trial. That in itself is huge value for pharmaceutical companies. Do not underestimate that. And that's what I'm saying, own your data. Obviously, you have to get to the point of actually clinical trials running, but that's, hopefully, that's some of the purpose of what we're trying to do here as well, to get you along that path. So the health systems, the insurers, the regulatory authorities, and there is different models in different countries, and that's why I'm using the word insurers there. So they want to know pharmacovigilance we talked about earlier on there. They want to know, is there any adverse events that would say, pull this drug, or especially because of thalidomide from, what's that, in the 50s and 60s? Is there any adverse events for pregnancies? And you can have, there's multiple different things, even from comorbidities you want to know. Somebody on taking diabetics drugs and this treatment actually have serious adverse events that nobody could have predicted because the trial that was run, nobody had diabetes on the trial. Okay? And then you have efficacy versus efficiency. Efficacy being, yes, this treatment can be beneficial to the condition. Efficacy is, yes, it's value for money as well. I know that's dangerous ground to get into from various different levels, but the health systems, they do look at these things, and we have to understand that and take that into consideration. And pharmaceutical companies, they're always trying to justify the costs they have on these things. So that is as interesting to pharmaceutical companies. They can prove the value-based outcomes. It's a term that's come from the US in the last 10 years, is to say the value to the patient is worth the cost of the treatment. HTA, there's health technology assessment. It's part of that route to get a national insurer or an insurance company to pay for the actual treatment as well. So I'll get away from the big questions around why and how, but the data definition. So this is as there's challenges in this as well. But if you start from the point, and especially when you're working with clinicians, because most of the data you want to capture for a really valuable data set is going to be clinical data. Capturing genetic data is relatively straightforward. Any one of us can get our data sequenced for £1,000. But it's the clinical data that backs that up that will actually help inform the researchers an awful lot more. What's actually which genetic variant? And what are the other subvariants that might be protecting you or protecting your siblings from the actual condition itself? So there's all of this, and it's a huge amount of data that can be built up. But when we're looking at data like this and what data we want to record, I'm sorry, I know I can talk an awful long time, so I'm going to go over. Think of it in recording the data on paper. How would we do it on paper? Because any IT system, it's going to closely mirror that. It won't be exactly the same. So we're talking about enrollment there. What data do you need to record when you're registering a person on the system? So generally it's demographic details, it's gender, it's maybe what expert center that they're a member of, or that where their clinical team resides. And then your baseline data is, here's the constant data, is the genetic variant and so on. And your follow-up then is every time you go to see the clinical team, what data is it that you would expect them to be recording or that they record. It may not be the same for every visit, but it's the data that they record that helps, again, to build up that natural history of your condition. Your PROs, we talked about patient-reported outcomes earlier on. That is as important for you. And the clinical teams have their own measures. PROs is one way to do it. They don't always take quality of life type questions into account as much as they should, at least not from your perspective. So this is something as much driven from the patient side of things, and ask the right questions in the quality of life questionnaires. And then more patient group focused things on surveys. Images there can be interesting as well, whether it's x-rays or photos of skin or photos of eyes, whatever, where you can see that progression over time, again, for your natural history data set. And somewhere in the future, there's lots of hype about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Somewhere in the future, that will actually start paying off something really interesting there. And so some of these images, if they're taken in the right way and are stored in a way that's usable like that, again, another rich data set there. Rich both to support the researchers, but rich also from your perspective that pharmaceutical companies or these health analytics companies will actually take that and that term that came out about 5 years ago, data is the new oil. Well, it is for some of these companies. They would look at images, they'd look at your your phenotypes, how your genetic variants are expressed, whether it's in the color of our hair, or our eyes, our taste, or our height, or whatever it would be. And adding to that then your clinical data. At some point or other, some of these systems will get good enough to actually be some value and be predictive about things and recommend things. And I'm running out of time already. So you also want to consider, especially if your first step is on a contact registry, you're going to be looking at getting as much data as is collectible by your members of your organization. So generally, it's not going to be clinical data. Have to be fair about it in terms of what it is that is available in front of them to put into a system to your members. And so that's the deep versus wide. The deep, what I mean there is deep data here is the clinical data, it's the labs data, it's the genetic variations and so on that you can capture, maybe not for everyone, but a sizable part of your population to build that data set to support research, to support what you want to do with pharma or care, quality of care. And then it's always, you have to think, is this really collectible data? Is that person going to have enough of that data? That it's going to be good quality data as well. And obviously, it kind of comes back, you always have to keep in your mind, what are the questions we're trying to answer? And even if it's only for the next 2 years, what are the questions we're trying to answer? Because the data you collect has to support those questions. And you won't know every question, but there should be 2 or 3 or 4 primary questions that you're saying, this is what's going to drive us to the next round. By the way, you need to have that in any case for GDPR. Have to have that for GDPR. And we're talking about, when I'm talking about GDPR, this privacy protection is a huge part of this as well. And you have anonymized data and pseudonymized data. Anonymized data means it's depersonalized. Nobody could in any way connect this data back to you, which is true or should be true for most data around the world. But when it comes to, well, you're in this registry and there's some details about it, and you're the one person in the UK in this registry, well, I'm sorry, somewhere or other, you, at least in theory, people go, well, you may have been raising funds or something, and it's in the papers. So there'll be a way to do that. But when we're talking about the generic thing, anywhere when somebody is doing research, when the data is, if it's an ultra-rare disease where there's only a handful of people in a specific region, the data that you actually, through your data governance, make available to others shouldn't identify the country that you're in. They may need to know your year of birth, because that shows the progression, or a 5-year if you're over 25, for example. But if it's children, they need to know what month you were born in, because the first 36 months, quite a lot of changes happen, and that progression can be quite dramatic there in those number of months, and to know where exactly they are there. And then other possible requirements. Do you need a patient portal or a patient app? Clinical portal, again, it's for the clinical teams to input data, and you have to understand their workflow and what they might need there. Researchers, access to anonymized data only. And they may want to go back and ask the patients or carers specific questions to support some of their research. And again, your governance has to be able to at least say, we allow it or we don't. And here's how you will do it if you want to do it. Dashboards, again, can be a requirement either from the registry side to understand, well, how many people have we recruited? How many questions are getting answered? What questions are not getting answered at all? Maybe we haven't, the English on it, maybe it's not good enough. Maybe the drop-down options don't make sense to people. You know, it's when you're asking questions, you want to get the answers out of the system. And if people aren't answering them, well, there's something wrong. And dashboards here can also help the clinical teams actually, if they understand what patterns they want to look for, the bigger scheme of things, well then you want to give them those dashboards so it's easy for them to see this when you as a patient is sitting in front of them. So they bring up the dashboard on you when you come into them. And then those patterns hopefully are obvious if they're there at all. And then you get into more complicated things in the data validation or migration if you already have data in older systems, and integration into the health systems, that becomes very expensive. And then from your own patient groups perspective, you also want to make sure that we want to be able to contact the patients. And will the system support you to do that? Well, how do you want to do it? Do you want to do it to subgroups? Do you want to do it on a regular basis? It's the same survey each time to build up that quality of life picture from people. And then you get into the design, develop, and deployment of it. So here, there's various different ways to do your registry. I'm sure many of you already use Excel spreadsheets. And that can work, absolutely. Obviously, you have GDPR compliance issues that you need to be careful of. But some common diseases are the data is recorded properly in electronic health records. So for cancers and the likes, there's a lot of structured data goes in there. Not very many electronic health records capture data for rare diseases. And they're definitely not connected to your local GP, or they're not connected between each other generally. And the NHS is probably one of the more advanced in the world in terms of connecting data together as well. Lots of countries, they connect data together on paper only, really. So you have various different types, whether it's from Excel, which I would consider it's a generic application, you configure it yourself for your needs, to custom configuration, where there's some platform that enables you to configure it for your specific needs, to custom development. And so you're developing an application from scratch. And we've seen this quite a lot, especially in the academic setting, where a professor or a lead clinician will ask a PhD to actually, please allow me collect this data. Okay? Other things then in the development and deployment to consider is your security and your hosting. Again, specifically on GDPR, those two are very important. You need to know the right security is in place, the right data contracting agreements can be put in place with whoever the hosting company is, and that they are going to respect your own data privacy and the boundaries around your data. After that, then you want to know that well, whoever is supplying me with this service, am I going to get the right level of technical support from them? Am I going to have a contract with them to support me when the registry has broken or has disappeared from the web? I want a number to call and bring that back up again. Okay. Statistical support is another one here. That's worth considering. It again, you've got different stages of development of the registry. At some point or other, for the clinical organization or to support them, you may want to actually run and know that the statistical parameters that you're adding to your research actually stands up to good rigor, so that when you're talking to your to the pharmaceutical company, or you're talking to your network of researchers, that you can put something in front of them that they will respect purely because you have that good statistical analysis plan to back it up. And obviously the ownership. You want to own whatever way it's deployed. There's a lot of examples out there of patient and clinical organizations not owning the data. They're entering that data into somebody else's system. And the number of cases where the academic institution has simply said, yeah, the professor that was running that is no longer interested in it, and we can't find anyone else to manage it, and there's data issues around it. Sorry, we're going to shut it down. Or product registries within a pharmaceutical company, and they're saying, no, it doesn't suit our business needs to carry on this research. It's way too expensive for us. The data that we've received on this, we're locking it up and sealing it away. We might come back to it in years' time, but it's not available to you in any way. So I would say absolutely own your data. Own your platform if you can, but own your data. Make sure that you can always get your data out of that platform in a reusable way. In terms of the development or the deployment of your system, there is project management on your side that you need. You need to understand, just as if you were building a house, there's things that you need to do along the way. And as much as the builder or the architect should be doing the things that you tell them to do, unless you're talking to them on a regular basis and getting feedback and making minor changes along the way when they're putting choices in front of you, you need to have that engagement all the time. And because you have to own this, so you have to project manage it. Acceptance testing here is, you have a criteria. Here's your criteria for the delivery of this thing. The house has to look good, has to have doors and windows, carpeted, painted. You know, these are the kind of the requirements that you have along the way that says, this is what we need for me to move in here. You have to know that you have your snag list as well, because it's only after living in the house you're going to say, okay, well, that's supposed to be hot water, and that's supposed to be cold water. They've got them piped the wrong way. Or every time I turn on this light, those plugs, they trip a switch somewhere. So, you know, and accidents happen. Same in software, exactly the same in software, even more so. And then for your deployment, ethics approvals. So for ethics approvals, my understanding in most countries, it's institution by institution. It's the way your ethics goes. There's a handful of countries where you may have one lead institution, they may take on ethics, and they will rubber stamp, or they will go through it in a fine-tooth comb, and once they do so, other institutions will refer to that lead institution. Very rarely goes beyond country. But part of ethics now, at least in most European countries, you have to have done a data protection impact assessment. It's one of those basic things in GDPR that says, I know what I'm doing, I've told the people what I'm doing, I have a proper level of consent, I have a proper security model here, and I'm allowing people to interact with the system as GDPR tells me I should. Most of those kind of things, even before GDPR, most ethics committees would have needed in any case, because generally speaking, the clinical and even the pharmaceutical world, they're ethically driven people. So gathering your data, you've got to promote the platform. Even before it's ready, you can start promoting it at your patient conferences, to your clinical researchers, to your network of researchers, if you're lucky enough to have a network established, to other patient organizations in other countries to say, we're developing this, please come on board. Even if you're paying for all of it, you're paying for the development of the platform, but don't forget, the value is also in the data, and as many patients that you can get on the system to support your cause, the better. And then recruiting the users, the next step below that, help them get on board on the platform. If it's the patients that are inputting the data themselves, or the expert centers that are actually recording that data, making sure that there's no major hiccups, that the ethics approvals are done, that they have, that you're mirroring something close to what the clinicians want, and as much as possible, what they actually have agreed on between themselves. And like I say, getting clinicians to agree on a data set of whether it's 100 data points or 50 data points, that's no mean feat. And then the sustaining that usage, making sure that it's not just that first eager inputting of data that happens in the first few months and then it tails off. You need to make sure that you can sustain that, especially for longitudinal data, for your natural history. You need that data to be built up over a long time, years of data to support what both the researchers and the clinical organizations will need to support the quality of care plans and so on. And curating the data, what I mean there is that you'll be looking at the data in different aspects of it, whether it's this question doesn't make sense now, or there's one option on this question we never considered. Maybe it's actually only relevant in France, but the clinicians there should be telling you, or whoever's inputting the data, you need to add this. It doesn't work otherwise. And then you'll want to map it to something that works on a more international level as well. And then you get into your data quality analysis. I mentioned earlier about a statistical analysis plan. This, only 1 minute. Your statistical analysis plan is to say, well, here's the data we expect into the system, and here's the reports we expect out of the system, and here's the actual statistical methods and mechanisms we're going to use to give real meaningful data, and that we can this can be used in academic journals to say, we're moving the research on here at this point, or in those engagements with the other organizations. And then it may mean tweaking your data set along the way, whether it's adding extra questions or removing questions that are no longer valid or whatever that might be. So then you want to go from your data to information. That's what we're talking about really with the statistical analysis plan. And having a set of scientific advisors there. And that might be whether it's researcher clinicians or people in the pharmaceutical industry or even people from other related areas that can bring some knowledge to help you make sure that you're asking the right questions, you're providing the right type of reports there. And I've talked about anonymous versus pseudonymous. So pseudonymous data that you may provide to others is that there's a way for you to link that data back to your patients within the data set. So it's not completely anonymous, but and you will need to support that for some of the types of data requests that comes along the way. There is an idea here, and you'll see it with ERNs, is the FAIR data principle, which is make your data findable, make it accessible, make it interoperable, and make it reusable. And there's various different criteria there, and it's not a yes, it meets this criteria, or no, it doesn't. It's a range of things. And some of this is, as was mentioned earlier, about making your registry findable. It means you register your registry with some of those, with Orphanet and with the several other organizations like that. You say, we're here, come and find us. If we can't find you, come and find us. And then accessible, well, define, if you want access to our data, here's how you access it. And it's very reasonable to say for academic use of the data, it may be free. For industrial use of the data, it may not be. And again, your own governance structure and your own patient organization should decide what you want to do there. And then after all that, so you've set your registry up, you've deployed it, you've gathered the data, you've analyzed the data, so what now? Well, you want to sit back and review it. You want to go through all of this to say, well, have we done a good job here? Have we actually answered the questions? Are we supporting the stakeholders that we had at the time in an appropriate way? Or actually, as we've rolled this out, some of these other stakeholder groups have now become involved. And what we're doing doesn't really support them. So we end up looking at what we've done to see where we need to go next, feed it back to your community, get buy-in, and move on to your next phase. So two examples then of what that might actually look like in practice. I know I've talked about a lot of various different things here, but if it's a contact registry, if that's the first step, and it's the first reasonable step to take for many, the purpose of a contact registry is to collect your data from patients so that we can start to understand the community and start conversations with clinicians and researchers. So only start conversation. You may not know what the right questions are for clinicians and researchers, but at least you can reach out into your own community. Focus. Data that's easy to enter by a carer. Annual surveys. And what type of data? Well, profile of your disease, the burden on it, the quality of life on it, the days of work you may lose because of it, or how many hours a week or a month that you might be able to work or to study or to have, in quotes, a normal life. And what interactions you have with the service. Is the health service actually meeting your needs? And different parts of the country you may find, or different parts of the world, health systems are obviously, they're very different beasts. And it's interesting if you can compare things like the interactions you have with the service to some of the disease burden and your quality of life. To see, actually, look at this. In that country, we get this device is a standard device that they provide. It's a relatively inexpensive device, but actually the burden of the disease is a lot lower because we use this device to monitor and have the appropriate interactions when it shows us we should. It's an example of it. But you may deploy this as printed forms. In your patient conference, you may say, please, everyone fill in these forms. It doesn't have to be electronic. You want to be careful where you store those forms, and there'll be work to put them in an Excel spreadsheet and do analysis, but you can start from there. So you collect your data through your forums, the word of mouth, your conferences. And if you can answer some of the simple questions, how many patients with subconditions, with other comorbidities, that actually they're not getting reported in other ways, that we need to, actually the health system should understand that there's a huge cost that they're putting under a different bucket, and they're not giving us the priority that we need because they've miscategorized us. Is there expert centers? Or is everyone going to the expert centers? And what's the most useful services that you're getting? Whether it's, like I say, those devices or repurposing a treatment that's already out there, or off-label use of a treatment that no clinician you're maybe self-medicating, but it actually shows you, and maybe some of the other people within the organization, it's actually working for us. So whether the clinician likes it or not, we're going to continue on this, and maybe some of the side effects from those kind of things, even for the acknowledged treatments that the clinicians are actually providing or giving you that treatment, there might be side effects here that the clinicians or the healthcare professionals may not be taking enough notice of because they're incidental. But for you as a patient group, it might be a very important thing. And then your review of this whole thing might be, okay, we need better surveys. Do we need clinical registry? Do we have enough information to get the clinicians actually involved to help us make that next jump? And it is a big jump between a contact registry and a clinical registry. But that's a step change in what you can do as an organization as well. So if we have a clinical registry then, the purpose of this, to enable clinical data to be entered in a clinical setting. It's not necessarily that the clinicians are entering the data. It might be that There's a research nurse there, and her job at the end of the day or the end of the week is to look at the paper records or the electronic records and actually say, for the 10 patients or the 5 patients with this condition that have come to this expert center, I'm going to input 15 or 20 data points on each one of them. And that's a reasonable place to go. And many organizations end up paying that clinical nurse for her or his 30 or 40 hours a year in working on that side of things. Obviously, there's potentially or retired professionals who may be able to help in a different way there as well. What you're trying to do is get comprehensive data from the healthcare professionals' data and use that then for the scientific committee. We've talked about the different types of data already that is available to them that is not available to you as a patient, or very rarely in any case. And it may be available to you because you're sitting in this room and you're here because you know the importance of data and gathering data. But the wider community that you're working with, some of this may not be comprehensible to them, may not be available to them, may actually be hidden from them by the clinical teams as well at one level or another. So something like that, it'll have to be an electronic health system to do that, but there are various possibilities there available to you. And to gather the data, it is the expert centers. Hopefully there is some for your conditions, whether it's nationally or internationally that you want to interact with. Outcomes, how do they differ between the centers and why? What are their off-label treatments or other parts of the world or other expert centers using that most other centers may not have considered or may have actually discounted for very good reasons? Maybe this shouldn't be doing their off-label usage anymore because it actually has no significant benefit. Might have incidental benefit for a subgroup of patients. And can that subgroup be identified? And then do you have enough information to support your researchers or pharma companies? Can we improve the quality of care? Do we want to interact with patients directly? Hopefully you get an idea of the big picture in terms of the steps that you need. And there are easy steps to take initially to give you that confidence to take the next steps. And as much as anything, there are other organizations that we should be talking to as well to say, well, how did you do it? What was the next step? Do you have a template I can use for this? What is the data governance? What legal companies did you use for your consent forms? Are the European reference networks doing something in this space? There's a lot of these kind of things around the place. And then you hopefully will find some pharmaceutical companies along the way that as you deepen your knowledge here and as you get your engagement with your own community, whether it's the clinical community or a patient community, you will get educational grants to help you take the next step. Okay? My contact details, and that's it.